Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ready, Set, Cyber, a deep dive into the issues and solutions in cybersecurity. I'm Rob Miller, a fractional chief revenue officer for growing companies and your host for today's show. Today, we're going to tackle one of the most pressing topics in cybersecurity, the role of government in shaping policy, defending against threats, and preparing for the future. In January, the United States Justice Department announced a federal indictment exposing a wide-reaching operation by North Korean operatives who infiltrated U.S. companies using stolen American identities to generate revenue and intelligence for the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or the DPRK regime. And this is certainly problematic. And perhaps the most surprising thing about the story is that it's not unique. This is one of many similar incidents that should serve as a reminder that cyber threats to our companies can also have serious national security and economic implications. So what is happening behind the scenes in government? How are policies evolving? Where are the gaps? And what do businesses need to know now? Joining us today is an incredible panel of experts who have worked across government, agencies, intelligence, and private industry. They bring firsthand insights into the complex world of national cybersecurity strategies, cyber warfare, and policy trends that impact businesses and individuals alike. Audience, we want to hear from you as well. If you're joining us live today, please type your comments and questions into the chat and we'll address them in real time. If you're watching this recording, you can post into the comments section and we'll be sure to get back to you. So without further ado, let's meet our panelists. First up is Philip Stupak. He's a cybersecurity and policy strategist and former assistant national cybersecurity director for the White House. We also have Darren Mott, AKA the Cyber Guy. Darren's a retired FBI special agent and cyber threat intelligence expert with Gold Shield. We also have Dan Lorman. He's with Presidio. He's a nationally recognized cybersecurity leader and former government CISO. And last but certainly not least is Dr. J. Burt Miller Jr. He's the Emerging Threats and Strategic Issues, ETSI, Division Chief with the National Security Agency, also known as the NSA, and Cyber Coffee Hour podcast co-founder and co-host. Welcome, everyone.
Good to be here.
Thank you.
Great to have you. Let's jump in. All right, so to start, let's set the stage. Cybersecurity is more critical than ever for governments. What do you see, and I'm posing this question to all of you simultaneously, as the biggest cyber threat facing national and state agencies today?
Suppose I'll go first, Rob. Thank you for moderating this podcast. Also, thank you for Ready, Set, Cyber for having each of us. It would be very easy for me to go back and forth naming foreign adversaries, saying the biggest threat is Russia or China or so on and so forth. But the truth of the matter is much more fundamental. Legacy IT is the biggest threat that we face right now. Built by the lowest bidder, sometimes decades ago, legacy IT is fit for the stated purpose of the RFP, which is function, not security. Today, government systems at every level, federal, state, local, tribal, territorial, international systems, all operate on an IT backbone that is fundamentally insecure and cannot be patched into security. Instead of replacing that legacy IT, we have taken a risk-based approach to slowly replacing segments of it. That means that we still have an unacceptable amount of risk across too many systems. And then I suppose if I had a second biggest risk, it would be supply chains, largely because all those vulnerabilities of legacy IT are multiplied by the same threat in each supplier's vendors and their vendors and their vendors and so forth. So sorry for taking two, but those are the two biggest threats that I'm seeing today.
Great points. Others?
Go ahead, guys. I don't know if you're going to jump in. I'll jump in. I just came from the CISO Academy last fall at the FBI, and they talked about the two big threats that nation-state attacks, and I'll let the other experts talk about nation-state attacks. But the big one that I focus on right now and talk a lot about is ransomware. It continues to evolve. It continues to be a threat that is growing. I just came out with a blog this last weekend that talked about how from Black Fog actually, but their annual report said the numbers, biggest ever in 2024 and continuing to go up in the beginning of 2025. So we can go through the data, we can go through statistics with that, but it's hitting local and state governments, it's hitting utilities, it's hitting water supply, it's hitting small and large companies, and it's continuing to evolve. And it's not your mother's or father's ransomware anymore. A lot of times they're not even encrypting data. They're just going right after the exfiltration, and they're going straight after the extortion of the organization. So I would say what's hitting people out, maybe outside the beltway around the country. And I can't argue with Phil's and other comments around other, supply chain and those, but I would say ransomware is a huge threat, certainly hitting governments and the public and private sector.
Yeah, one thing I'll even add to that, piggybacking off what Dan just mentioned, as we talk about ransomware, but also with ransomware being enhanced with the use of AI tools and different technologies, it is becoming, not becoming, I believe it already is a big concern for if you look at different universities, especially hospitals. I think hospitals are hit quite hard, and because they always kind of left it that situation where, especially I think with hospitals is very unique, where a lot of times they're dealing with life and death situations, so they don't really have a lot of time to be kind of going back and forth to say should we pay or not, because when you do pay, you kind of leaving that door open for another attacker to do the same thing and then kind of raising those stakes. But yeah, it's having that, trying to protect yourself, protect your networks against these, I would say, more enhanced ransomware attacks, because it is with the usage of AI, it is becoming much more prevalent.
Mm-hmm. I think I'll expand on all of that, where from what's the biggest threat risk? I mean, we can all have opinions on that. I think the biggest problem is most entities, whether you're government, whether you're private sector, public sector, whatever, there's too many entities that don't understand the threats that are even targeting them. They don't understand who's coming at them, who's trying to get their information. And then many think, well, I'm too small for anyone to want to target me. I don't have anything anyone would want. Those are probably the two big things I've heard many, many times over. And usually it's because I showed up as an FBI agent and they had just got hacked and they said, how'd this happen to us? We were too small. We thought we were too small, and as Dr. J said, healthcare, huge issue. They're getting hit all the time. Law firms getting hit all the time. And those are entities that don't necessarily think about being perhaps huge targets of cyber crime or cyber bad guys, but everybody is. It doesn't matter what business you're in. I can tell any business, I can come look at your business and give you in about 5 minutes who's going to come target you and why. And, ransomware is a huge issue, but the thing that you don't hear a lot about is business email compromise, where bad guys get into an email system and defraud companies of billions of dollars. The number 2 cyber crime year in and year out. It used to be number 1 to a cryptocurrency fraud, overtook it. And it's 29 times the amount of loss per year from ransomware. But ransomware is very sexy from a media perspective. And that's another problem with media we can get into maybe another time. But that's my take on that.
These are all great topics. We're going to deep dive into as many of them as we can, given the short amount of time we have together. But Dan, let's talk a little bit more about state and local cybersecurity. You mentioned ransomware, I believe. What are the biggest cybersecurity challenges and the gaps that state and local governments face? In other words, how do they work with businesses? How do they get around this ransomware challenge? Do you have any thoughts about solutions?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. And I should have mentioned it earlier. Thanks again for being a part of this amazing panel of experts. It's really an honor to be here. So thanks for your leadership in moderating. I think state and local governments, to the legacy point that was made earlier by Phil and the challenges with the workforce are certainly huge, and it does really vary. I often like to say you need to segment. There's always seems to be the same in the last 20 years I've been working in government cybersecurity. There's leaders, followers, and laggards. So not putting everybody in one basket is hard, but it's maybe like a third. But even whether you're talking about large governments, small local governments, whether you're counties, cities, universities, they all struggle with getting talent, keeping talent. Talent is a big issue. Budgets overall, I think right now with what's going on in Washington, we're all seeing that in the news. Most of that's in the federal government, but there's a lot of fear around, is that going to impact local governments as well? Is that going to be hitting budgets around Medicare, Medicaid? Is it going to be hitting, because states are custodians of federal programs. So criminal justice, CJIS programs, you start talking about all the different things states do. And so I think, the talent challenge, the budget challenge, the things that were mentioned, certainly around supply chain, those are all, challenges. And I think, starting to talk about some solutions, I mean, I think it really is, there's a lot of work going on that's happening right now with the multi-state ISAC, Information Sharing Analysis Center, working together and partnering across governments and the private sector is really the ultimate answer to the question. I mean, how do you partner? You will fail if you're an island. So working together with other organizations, with other governments, partnering with criminal justice organizations, I think is key. But I think, you know, a lot of stress right now for government teams, because I think a lot of them are understaffed. A lot of them are in hiring freezes right now, and they are facing budget challenges. So all of those things are ongoing in state government at the moment.
Yeah, makes sense, and a much bigger issue for perhaps a future conversation. Phil, you're here. I want to ask you a specific question. We've heard the phrase "know thine enemy," which may be relevant here. How does the government go about knowing the enemy? How have the lines between nation state threat actors and cyber criminals blurred? Are they sometimes one and the same? And as part two of this question is, what can the private sector learn from this knowledge as regards threats to them?
Yeah, what a great question, Rob. Thanks. When it comes to knowing thine enemy, we're really thinking about attestation, right? And how we attest activity online. And we've come a very long way since 1997, when the Clinton administration feared Iraq was behind Solar Sunrise. For those of you who don't remember Solar Sunrise, it was the most pernicious cyber attack at that point, largely targeting DoD and other government agencies. But it turns out it wasn't Iraq. Instead, it was a bunch of teenagers in California, along with an 18-year-old in Israel. Since then, the United States government has successfully named and brought attestation publicly against North Korea for the Sony hack. That was during Obama. For SolarWinds that occurred during the first Trump presidency, we named Russia. And of course, the Microsoft Exchange hack, Salt Typhoon, Volt Typhoon, all we've named the PRC publicly. And each of those were done during the Biden administration. So the government's gotten pretty good at this. We're pretty good at looking at all the details of a particular cyber attack to know who was likely behind it, so much so that we're willing to publicly name and shame. Now, much of that attribution is done in consult with elite private sector firms like CrowdStrike, Microsoft, Mandiant, now part of Google, Recorded Future, now part of MasterCard. Those firms are also really good at what they do. Some of them use open source intelligence. Some of them look at all the logs that they have access to, because oftentimes what's being targeted are their systems or the systems they've been paid to protect. So they have a lot of very capable people who work for them who can help filter in the information that then goes to the United States government so we can publicly attribute a cyber attack to someone. On your second question, I think this is a very interesting one about blurring lines between state and non-state actors. And yes, absolutely that is occurring. We saw it in the 2007 cyber attacks against Estonia, when Russian efforts to attack Estonia were filtered through non-state actors, perhaps less successfully than they thought. A decade later, an unsealed DOJ indictment publicly named the Russian Federal Security Service of working with cyber criminals to gain access to Yahoo. And of course, in China, we see a thriving ecosystem of PLA Unit 61398 officers who have taken an entrepreneurial approach to their jobs. They gain skills within the government, and then they leverage their state-sponsored skills in off-hour criminal activity. So where is the line between state action and non-state action? Well, the Tallinn Manual, which brought together academics, government, NGOs, to kind of create some initial standards and baselines on cyber attacks. The Tallinn Manual, to be clear, this is not international law, but it attempts to set a standard for when the state becomes responsible for non-state activity. It's a fairly good starting point, and usually it looks at whether the state either directed or turned a blind eye to the activities that were going on.
Right.
The state is actively trying to stop that criminal behavior. Okay, that probably is not purported to be state action. But in a more simple way of kind of looking at this is the first time we had to deal with this issue, right?
Understood.
I'm reminded of mafia crime families, right? Where the head of the family never actually commits a crime themselves.
Right.
Rather, they have others operating on their behalf.
But they are complicit and perhaps they directed it, but always through a middle person.
Right.
Something.
Exactly right. Always through a middle person. So that's why we created RICO statutes back in the 70s. I think it was the 70s, maybe as late as the 80s, so that a criminal action by any one member of the family is reported to the entire organization. Here, too, I think that's the right way to go about it. And I think it's kind of what the Talon Manual is trying to get at.
Yeah.
So if the PRC turns a blind eye to a PRC officer using PRC provided skills to support ransomware gangs, then there are no laws.
Right.
That should be deemed state-sponsored criminal act.
Right. All right. So Phil, a little bit of what you're talking about here is disinformation. And Dr. J, I want to come to you real quick. So in the January edition of Ready Set Cyber, we talked about top cyber threats of 2025, and you mentioned disinformation as a real issue. How can the government and private sector work together to guard against this?
Rob, great question. So I believe when you're trying to combat, disinformation is going to require a multifaceted approach. Of course, that collaboration between government and private sector, it's pretty much critical, honestly. And there's few areas to look at when it comes to that collaboration to really see success. So you look at information sharing and analysis, public awareness and digital literacy, research and development, and crisis response and coordination. I'll just quickly just probably a little background for each one. So when we're looking at information sharing and analysis, so for the government side, they can share intelligence on disinformation campaigns on, different private sector platforms. So that will help to identify and help mitigate threats. From the private sector side of it, private sector companies, they can provide government agencies with data and, insights on different disinformation trends. So that way that can help lead to more effective and more precise countermeasures. Mm-hmm. So looking back, so we look at public awareness and digital literacy standpoint. So from the government side, governments can fund and support public awareness campaigns to help educate citizens. I think education is definitely a big piece. I think we kind of touched on it a little bit, just having that awareness, knowing what's about, what you're dealing with. So that's a big part of it. So if you're able to educate our citizens about this information and what to look for and how to identify it. From the private sector perspective, private sector companies, they can integrate, different digital literacy tools, different resources into their platforms. You can pretty much kind of bake it in. That way, it helps to empower users to think more critically when it comes to different information that they're encountered with. When looking at research and development, from governments, they could fund research into the cause and effect of disinformation, like just try and get that background as to why this has happened and be able to learn from that and almost like you kind of doing like a lessons learned and be able to evaluate and pick apart. And that way, when you're put in that situation again, you're better apt to respond. Private sector companies, they can invest in the research and development of different AI-powered tools to help identify and mitigate disinformation. And lastly, when we talk about the crisis response coordination, so both government and private sector platforms, they can coordinate those responses to during different crises. So that way we have to ensure that you have accurate and timely response, because timing is definitely is critical, especially when depending on the situation or who's involved. Your response time is very important. So having that coordination amongst government and private sector, having a streamlined approach on how to do that is very important.
Great points, Dr. J. Thank you. And to those folks who are leaving comments in the chat, keep them coming. They're great. Darren, you've been very patient. I want to make sure we get to you. The U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency recommends that companies get back to the basics of cybersecurity. We've touched upon a couple of those, I think, already. In your opinion, what are some of the key basics? And, from your experience in federal law enforcement, how do you help companies get there?
Thanks, Rob. I appreciate the softball, because it hits right into my wheelhouse of things I talk about all the time on I have several podcasts. The one I do in the morning is a Cyber Smart Morning News Update. And I research the news every day to see what is going on, who's getting hit, who's being targeted. And if you take a look at the data breaches that are currently going on, the different cyber crimes that are occurring, it's companies that should know better. SolarWinds, for example, should never have had been compromised, but they had a bad password. The SolarWinds 123, maybe had an exclamation point. I can't remember at this point.
Right.
Microsoft, they've been compromised. You would
You
think that
forgot the exclamation
Microsoft.
point, Darren. Sorry.
What's that?
You forgot the exclamation point on the end. Sorry.
Oh,
Please.
yeah, I thought that. I wasn't sure, but like Microsoft, how many times we have to talk about Microsoft having a compromise? They should be able to afford to do the basics, but bad guys in general, hackers are not in general hacking into your system. They're logging in because your credentials are out there. You don't have multi-factor authentication. You're not patching, which really not going to help you log in. But there's just certain things that companies should do from a basic level. And that was the initial question. So I've kind of expanded out to that, but it's, are you have a regular patching cadence? Do you have good passwords? Do you have multi-factor authentication? I mean, those three things right there will solve a lot of your problems, but most companies look at cybersecurity as a cost. It is a cost. They're not making money on it unless you are a cybersecurity company, then you're making money. But if you're a bank or you're a healthcare entity or you're a law firm, whatever, you're not making money doing cybersecurity. It's costing you money. But what they fail to realize, and maybe this is the biggest basic they don't realize, is that single loss event, if it were to occur, is going to cost them millions of dollars on average. The average cost of a data breach is $4.5 million at the last time I looked. So that single event is going to cost you that much. There was a healthcare facility in the Midwest that went out of business. 6 facilities had to close down because they couldn't afford the aftermath of their ransomware breach. And so I say all that to kind of say, understanding what's coming at you and look at that from sure, we're going to have to pay this amount up front monthly, but this is the amount that's going to result if we have that one single incident. For what you could pay for quality cybersecurity assistance, you could probably go 50 years paying that versus that one time event. So it's a failure to realize how easy it is for the bad guys to get in. And 2 other basics to understand, and this is 20 years in the FBI doing this. There's a couple hard truths that companies need to understand if they are compromised or targeted. 1, probably no one's getting arrested. And if you lose money, number 2, you're probably not getting their money back. Now, there are exceptions to all that, right? That does occur, but it's the exception rather than the rule.
Yeah, understood. I can't remember if it was you that mentioned this earlier, but you talk about basics like multi-factor authentication or email compromise, which happens when you don't have some of these basics in place, is 29 times bigger problem than ransomware.
Correct. Yeah.
So, it's fundamental that you get some of these things done. And I know we've got small and mid-sized businesses here today. These are the things that you can do that are, with some assistance, perhaps, affordable and not that difficult to implement, and perhaps, really put a big wall up, against some of these attacks.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Okay, let's move a little bit more into the private sector. Phil, I want to come back to you. What new policies or regulation should we expect to see from the government to strengthen cybersecurity?
Yeah. So first, I actually want to jump on this MFA discussion and back to the basics that we're just having. Right before we began the show, Dan and I were talking about one of our people in common. Chris DeRusha, who was the former CISO for the federal government during the early years of the Biden administration. And he was pretty much the godfather of putting zero trust architecture in place within the federal government. He wrote the first memo on it, defining what we meant by it. And really that was to ensure that we had MFA at every single agency. Everyone had this turned on because that really is the basics that we have to go to. Similarly, also moving to encryption for all data at transit and all data at rest, just the basics. This is what you have to do. But talking about newer regulations that are coming out, I'm glad that we're talking about this because one of the last actions that I took within the administration was drafting President Biden's last cybersecurity and national security executive order, which was Executive Order 14144. Came out the last Friday of his administration. So we all thought it would exist for 96 hours, 72 of it being a weekend and a holiday. But instead, President Trump decided to keep it in place because it is predicated upon just where we need to move as a country and as a government. There's a few items in that regulation that I do want to highlight, probably about 6 of them if I've got the time, but Rob, feel free to cut me off anytime here. One of the more important is over the last 4 years, we've done a lot of work on secure software development frameworks and the attestations that go along with it so that companies say, yes, we have this policy in place. Yes, we're doing it. We attempted to define it in prior executive orders and executive action, but the new one really defines what you have to do, as well as the fact that we're going to begin auditing them to see whether or not they're actually being followed. So that's a big change for the private sector.
I was just going to say, well, if you have one more example of the site, please go ahead.
I'll give you one more. All right. The one that I'm actually most excited about is that this EO is the very first one to ever touch on space. And space cybersecurity is extraordinarily important. We don't do nearly enough about it. The truth is, you can't really update a satellite in orbit. I can't put multi-factor authentication on Voyager, but I can do it on the ground systems that communicate with those space systems. And so we're taking the first steps towards understanding all of our potential vulnerabilities at ground-based systems and how we secure those space-based systems that our entire way of life is based on.
Excellent. Love the examples. If anyone else has a comment they want to chime in with, please do.
Yeah, can I chime in on this one quick? This is and Dan, I mean, I'm sorry, Phil, I'm not gonna pick on the strategy stuff, but I started a podcast called Tactical Cyber specifically because, let's be honest, and again, I'm not looking for an argument here. I want to get your opinion. We've been doing strategy and executive orders for God knows how long. What has it done? What we need is, in my opinion, right? What are the tactical solutions? Do this, and this, and it will help you, as opposed to, we're going to create this nebulous whatever, like CSRB. I'm going to rail on CSRB. Did nothing. Okay, had 4 reports or 3 reports, whatever. What did it do? What did it solve? So, I mean, I understand the need for executive orders to have a strategy, but we keep doing strategy upon strategy. Where is the tactical solution that we can have that can actually help businesses protect themselves? Because is this executive order actually going to stop a healthcare entity in Florida not get hacked? And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe, again, I didn't read it all the way through and digest it, but this is where I come down on just getting frustrated with the constant need for strategy. I mean, the State Department came up with a cybersecurity strategy. When I think of cybersecurity strategies, the State Department is not the place I'm going to. So again, maybe this is 20 years of just government killing me. So in the government, I'm coming from the government. So I get it. So I wanted to pop in on that because I saw that question. I'm like, I don't know if I can keep myself quiet from that. So Rob, I apologize for taking over the conversation. But
No, it's a great point. Although I think you're undervaluing how good these strategies look on my shelf. Right?
Yeah, good stuff.
But look, that was one of the reasons why Congress created the Office of the National Cyber Director in the White House, is that we have had all these strategies. Are we actually safer? That's the fundamental question. Are we safer? And in the words of Senator Angus King, our office was created to give him one throat to choke on cyber policy. Fortunately, that's the National Cyber Director and wasn't mine. I was just the Assistant National Cyber Director. But when we were thinking about the second iteration of our office, how should it look like? We broke it into 2 pieces. One was policy development, which continues writing all the strategies that you're discussing. And one was policy implementation, because that's what actually matters. Right. Are we living up to the statements that we are making within those strategies? Are we actually doing it? So my office, my team tracked how far we were on moving towards multi-factor authentication, for example, across the territory. Some agencies, 50%, not good enough. Others at 90%. Okay, I can live with 90%, right? There's going to be some delta there that are going to be very difficult to do until we get rid of that legacy IT problem I discussed at the very beginning. So that is how we started thinking about it a little bit differently, is that implementation element. And I would challenge you to look at the National Cybersecurity Strategy. The very last section on it is all about implementation. How are we going to hold ourselves accountable? Our office then would work with each of the departments and agencies to ensure that they were doing the things they said they would do within that document. And then they put out an annual report. One of the best reports ever put out, the annual posture report, because it goes to Congress and says, hold us accountable, measure us. Mm-hmm. In the first year, we said we would do these 100 things. We did 92% of them. We should have done 100%. We only got 92%. Okay, we can build upon that. I think that's the move. That's where we have to go as a government, is holding ourselves much more accountable than just saying, we'll do these grandiose things. We'll solve these things in a decade. And, by then someone else will be in charge. So I would suggest that's what you want to look at. I would also come right back to this executive order that we put out on hospitals. The last section, Section 7, It's all about IT modernization, clearly something that's on my mind. And we charged NIST with, I think they have about 270 days to establish minimum cybersecurity practices for industry. I think that will do more than almost everything else to help improve that baseline for what industry should be doing. Although I'm glad I don't have to write those standards, because that's going to be a huge challenge. But NIST
but NIST has to scale it down to make it usable. It can't be like 800, 171 or 853. It's got to be something that is digestible for those healthcare entities to be able to utilize it.
But then how will I have my next job?
Well, perhaps your next job is taking all those beautiful color-coded documents behind you and distilling them into something that's more practical. I love how, by the way, my bookshelves, which you can't see because they're in front of me, are very, very similar. So nice job. Look, I want to actually continue down this path where we're talking about practical implementations. We've actually had a couple comments come into the chat window. And since we've mentioned MFA a couple of times, I want to focus on one thing regarding MFA real quick. And that is, everyone kind of hates it. All of these OTPs and data, frankly, flying back and forth just creates a lot of friction for workforce, for vendors, for people, remote healthcare workers. We're talking about healthcare businesses. This is a question then for anyone who wants to jump into the fray. But are there things like biometrics? Are there ways we can simplify that process?
Yes, but remember why we have MFA? It's because I think Heath Spencer said exactly right. Passwords suck. They're terrible. And sometimes friction is the point. We want to slow certain activities down. We don't want it to be easy. So yes, we can make these things better over time, and biometrics would be a great way to do it. Although then I think you will have half the country up in arms on why we have the biometrics of half the country. But that is probably a direction we can move in to make some of these things a little bit more seamless. But you have to understand, when is efficiency and seamless actually causing a security problem, and when is friction probably the right way to go.
Well, I think the way some of us might look at it is the seamlessness of it, or at least the removal of human error, actually makes it both elegant and more efficacious. So anyway, I'll pause at that. Any other comments from the peanut gallery on this one?
I think you're always going to have an argument, or it's going to be that constant battle between convenience and then security. If you try to make it more convenient for folks or easier for folks to log into the systems every day, there's certain elements of security will have to be stripped down. But if you want your system to be more secure, it's not going to be as convenient. So I mean, I think that's where you have to make a decision, looking at what individually, like what you're protecting, like what's on your networks, how what priority do you put the data that you're managing at, and then go from there. Then you want to address it appropriately, or how much secure, this may be painful, but if this gets compromised, it's going to be even more painful. So I think a lot of companies, organizations do have to make that decision. I don't know if you're ever going to get to a point where everyone is going to be happy. I think there's always going to be that pain point when it comes to security, because the data that you have, or that's on your network, that's sitting on your networks, is just too valuable for you to risk being compromised, because people don't want to use MFA or any sort of security measure to get to that data.
Right. Look, I think, Dr. J, let's stay with you. I mean, I think one of the things that's important is, yes, maybe a little bit of friction is important. You're never going to please everyone. You're not going to make everyone happy all the time. But there are technologies out there that can make this better, and make both sides a little bit happier, right? Just enough friction to make it difficult, not so much friction that your vendors, your employees, and other folks involved in your business are struggling or creating headaches for your help desk. But just staying with you, and I think this is pertinent to the next question I wanted to ask, which is, what role does communication play in strengthening national cybersecurity? So are there things that can be done to help people understand new technologies, or perhaps, there's something else there that I'm not thinking about, where private and public can work together?
No, that's awesome, Rob. Yeah, communication is definitely key. It's vital, in strengthening, national cybersecurity between, of course, public and our private sectors. So kind of like a little bit like what I shared earlier. A couple of things, So first, if you're looking at it from when we're looking at information sharing and government agencies that and private organizations, they can promptly share threat intelligence. So when it comes to pertinent things that are happening in real time, they need to have those open lines of communication, because as I mentioned earlier, the timing is critical. If there's too much of a delay, or there's friction between government and private sector on a particular issue, like, no, we handle this, or you're gonna risk that particular mission or that response to be a failure. So you want to have that communication where you're able to work in a manner that's proactive as opposed to reactive, and that way we're working together, trying to see what may be coming down the pike and try to get ahead of it, and that way you can have a better managed response when those things happen.
Yep.
From an education awareness perspective, again, you want to have like that public awareness about cybersecurity threats and different and best practices. I know we touched earlier about we get very surprised when we hear certain breaches and big organizations still using password one or whatever for their password. But that also goes to show that for even not even just look at high level with different organizations, just look at the people that we encounter with every day, even our family members, just of that nature, having that awareness, just having those public awareness campaigns to say, hey, if you're going to be accessing this, or if you're going to be accessing your bank account, don't use that Starbucks Wi-Fi, or make sure you're using a VPN, right, or things of that nature.
Right.
Because there are a lot of these best practices that we may see as professionals as definitely should do in that, but the common person who doesn't work in this field may not know, or just not aware of it, or does not understand enough to know to do it. So I think that's where it comes. Maybe behold on us to have those education sessions to explain why this is necessary, why it is helpful, especially in help people to understand why this is going to help protect them and their data. Like I said, as I mentioned, if you're accessing sensitive information, as you mentioned, like with banking and things of that nature, you want to make sure you're being protected and also protecting their families and this and that nature. And I'll say, I'll just say lastly, so if there's like a lack of clear communication to the general public, when we touch on that, it's going to create that uneasiness. So when cybersecurity information is not, because it can be very technical, it's not easily understood by maybe the average person. So it does create that gap of awareness, or where folks don't want to adopt it, or really don't want to pay much attention to it. Those who may be familiar, there's a recent new show on Netflix, and I'm not paid by Netflix or anything like that, but it's called Zero Day, and so Zero Day with like Robert De Niro and Angela Bassett. It's very good so far, but the reason I bring that up is that even within the show, I noticed there's even a bit of like education campaigns, I'd say, because they're using very specific cybersecurity terms, but they do explain it in a way for the common person who doesn't know about this to know, okay, that's what Zero Day means, or that's what or VPN is, or things of that nature. You're educated, so you're bringing that education into the entertainment field, so that way folks can know and see. And you see as you're watching your show, as you're on episode 3 or 4, you're actually learning about different cybersecurity elements, and that's actually happened within the real world. So I think there's different ways that we could go about that to help educate the masses.
And so that's a great point. I mean, you've mentioned education a bunch. Communication is very important. Using entertainment as a vehicle for that is tremendous. But those things take money, right? That show costs a lot of money to make. Comms departments and require budgets. Dan, I have a question for you. How can local governments and companies with limited budgets, we've talked about budgets being cut across the board, how can they meet these growing demands? And how can we continue to basically stay ahead of the cyber criminals and educate the public and other things that need to be done?
Yeah, I want to get to that. Great question. I want to just jump on one thing that Dr. J mentioned that I really think is important, and that balance that I was going to jump in earlier in the kind of back and forth with Darren and the complexity versus the simplicity. And I worked for a security awareness training company for 7 years before I was with Presidio, and one of the things we used to say is brief, frequent, focused communication, and then teaching people things they don't already know. Kind of what Dr. J was talking about, putting it in we. I'm not putting a plug in for that company. I won't even name it, but you can go look at my LinkedIn profile and find that. But basically, the idea was, really gamify it, make it interesting, engaging, using people's language that they use. And people, so many times, I think awareness, and we talk about MFA, but the same thing could be said. It's that kind of yin and yang back and forth. How much security is enough. And I'm a big advocate of MFA. I encourage my family and friends and community and to be, using that. But I think that the challenge of and getting into the budget discussion is really keeping it relevant. I also heard just recently in the last couple of weeks, people saying, different companies talk about AI and using AI in communication and training. And then the challenge, the balance of that, which is partially the answer. But getting this balance right is really hard, because then I see some other blogs out there, some other podcasts saying that people are really getting ticked off at how often they're having to do phishing exercises at work, and how often they're getting very good at testing people, but then people feel like it's too much. So getting that balance right it's a big challenge, and it leads into the budget discussion as well. And I do think we need to be educating. We need to be doing brief, frequent, focused communication. But with the budget piece, I have a couple of different answers I want to just lay out for people. And the one thing I'd say to security pros out there, and also any technology pro, you need to be getting on boats that are leaving the dock. Because what I mean by that is I see, I hear this a lot. I mentor a lot of CISOs around the country. I hear a lot budget issues. I hear a lot of challenges. And one of my first questions I ask people is, what are the top 3 priorities for your government? What are the top 3 projects you're working on? And sometimes they don't know, sometimes they do. And they say, well, I know, AI is one of them. We're doing this, we're doing that. But I'm not involved in those projects. I'm like, well, why isn't your team involved in those projects? And I use the analogy for people sometimes is this, picture this, you got kind of a money island out there, and all these boats are going out to the island, but you're like, I can't get out there. That's where all the resources are, all the people, all the expertise. But my team doesn't seem to be able to get involved in that. We don't have a boat. We have no way to get out there. I'm like, well, look at all those boats leaving the dock. Get on one of those boats leaving the dock. And what I mean by so I learned this in government the hard way, and really doing lunch with the business side, really getting to know the priorities. Every government, every private sector company I know is always spending money on something. So the question is, are your people involved in that? Early in my CISO career as a state CISO in Michigan, we were having budget issues as well, and people were saying, "Well, Dan, are you involved in the CJIS project? It was a criminal justice program rewrite, $100 million project." Well, no, we're not involved in that. There's a tax rewrite system, $150 million. Are you guys involved in that project? Well, no, we're not involved in that. Are you involved in the? There were 3 large projects over $100 million. So making sure, and we got our people on those teams, made sure that we were a part of those teams, and we're an enabler on those teams, and not just there to say no, but really having being involved in what the priorities are for your government or your company, your organization, making sure that you're an enabler and you're getting budget on those funded priorities that are involved. Number 2, real quickly, I'll just go through these two other quick things I want to mention. There's other ways with compliance, all the things we mentioned earlier around compliance, the new regulations around that. In state and local government, especially, there's a group called State Ramp, which has now been renamed to GovRamp. So these are organizations that help you procure systems that are secure. So making sure procurement is involved in the discussion, that as you're purchasing, as you're integrating systems, that you're doing that in a way that is smart, and that the language, the terms and conditions, the legal language around these systems are secure. So making sure that you're involved in those procurements and that wording. And then lastly, I just want to mention, making sure, as I mentioned earlier, doing lunch. A lot of times security pros, technology pros are great at meeting with other technology pros or our peers or other people in the industry, other companies. But I say, how was the last time you really, with the business side,
Right.
and sat down, did lunch, did breakfast, really talked to them about what they're trying to accomplish, what they're trying to do in the government you're involved in or the company you're involved in, and then see, are there secure ways that you can enable that? And that really will change your view of your job and your role and how you work between the business side and the technology side and the security side of your company or your government. I think those relationships are really key, making sure that if you're involved in those conversations, then Rob, you'll be getting the budget that you need to get the things done you need to get done.
Right. Excellent. Great points about prioritization. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, can I just jump on one thing that Dan said about phishing, which is kind of interesting. I love telling stories. So there was a story of a company that, like Dan said, people are getting tired of phishing testing, right? Because then they don't feel it works. I got to go pretty much. So there's a company that sent out a phishing test at the end of the year around bonus time about the bonuses. And everybody clicked the link. And then they all complained that it was a phishing test. Well, I'm sorry that you're complaining, but that's what the bad guy is going to do. So that test was perfect, in my opinion. But anyway,
Right.
I digress.
No, I agree. And you need phishing. I'm just getting at it's that balance. I was
Yeah.
what Dr. J was saying. It is a challenge. It's not just with MFA. It's in all areas of cybersecurity. It's like how much is enough? How much is too much?
Well, perhaps it makes the point that you got to go to where the puck is. I mean, and that's a perfect example of utilizing context, year-end bonuses to get people even more excited or make them easier targets. Frankly, Darren, let's stay with you. So actually, this is a perfect entree to this next question. What are cyber criminals doing differently now as compared to, let's say, 5 years ago?
Right. So I think a lot of them are still doing kind of the same. There's really not much has changed because stuff still works. But I think the two big areas of change that I've seen over the course of the last year or two, obviously AI is a huge change in how they're doing what they do. Like if you would get a phishing email from somebody in Eastern Europe or in East Asia, their English probably not perfect. You can kind of pick out this is not real. But now with AI, they can very easily create what looks like a very realistic email. And there's now AI specific tools that are malware design that can help design malware that can easily find vulnerabilities within software and allow them to get access to. The other big area is the move towards operational technology networks, OT networks, right? We see a huge combination now of OT moving into IT space. And as far as those two things speaking together with our critical national infrastructure companies. And I mean, the most recent ones are the attacks on the water facilities. I'm sure the electrical and infrastructure area has got some issues that they're dealing with. Telecommunications, I mean, AT&T with their Snowflake thing. Now that was a little different. It was more of a criminal oriented thing than a nation state, but that shows the vulnerability there that allows them to now that was not OT necessarily, but just to make the point that it hit telecommunications. But these legacy systems, like mentioned earlier, that there's a lot of legacy OT that you just can't upgrade and that has vulnerabilities that are almost unfixable without the cost required to upgrade them. So those are probably the two biggest areas, OT and AI. But bad guys are going to do what works and what's easiest. And they're now attacking remote access tools because it's easier to get in than trying to hack in.
Yep. All right. Let's turn our attention with the time we have left to future outlook. And some of what was just mentioned is relevant to this, like legacy systems. Phil, I have a question for you. Rumor has it that governments are generally behind when it comes to technology. We've talked about lots of policy and things that are happening that are staying abreast, or at least maybe only just one step behind. First of all, is that a true statement? Are governments actually behind, or are they further ahead than we think? And I have a second part to this too, but maybe start with that.
Well, it depends, right? There is no homogeneous government. And what U.S. Cyber Command has and their capabilities are far different than what the EPA has, right?
Right.
So it depends on who you're talking about within the government. Within the government, there's always going to be someone at that cutting edge. And then there's going to be a lot of lagging indicators behind them. And so, yes, it is a problem, but for most companies or for most agencies, much like for most companies, you may not necessarily need that cutting edge capability. For those who do need special access, those who do need to do all the work that they do to defend the nation on a daily basis, they probably need it. And most of them have what they need. So it's a mixed bag. I recognize that's a very lawyerly, it depends type answer, but it really does depend.
Okay. Fair enough. Maybe some others will jump in. But I want to pose a part two to you and then also everyone else. And that is how will AI and quantum computing, we've touched upon at least AI a little bit, factor into cybersecurity in the next 1, 5, 10 years, to the degree you guys have a crystal ball that you can look into?
I think the promise of AI within cybersecurity has been overstated for quite some time. That doesn't mean that there is no promise to it. If we think about Kitty Hawk, 1903, 1908, the first plane is tested by Fort Myers, part of the Department of the Army. 1917, U.S. uses the very first planes in combat. 1945, planes end of World War on 2 separate continents. That's a 42-year gap. AI is at its infancy right now. It's not particularly strong on that second initial, but as it becomes more capable, we will begin seeing it more in the government. I would not suggest that we are going to see it being used at scale over the next 1 to 2 years. There are a few agencies that are using AI to try and find some vulnerabilities in their systems to patch it. GSA is probably one of the leading agencies on the use of AI to build a more secure environment. But that's more what we're seeing are these niche cases rather than being used and deployed across the entire federal government.
Anyone else have thoughts on this topic?
So I'm gonna jump in quickly and say I half agree and half disagree. I think that it's being used against us. It depends on what, again, deep fakes and those kinds of things have been around for a while. But if you start talking about the voice phishing, the tools used, the multi-language, the ability to, we talked about phishing a minute ago, but using AI, the bad actors are starting to use it. And so I think, I see this accelerating. The internet is an accelerator and AI is like turbocharging the internet. And so, I just think that we're going to be seeing a lot of attacks, and you're going to have AI going over the next 5 years, but really over the next 2-3 years. You need to be incorporating AI in your defenses now. The good news is that most of the cyber companies are doing that, and they're rolling it in their tool sets as part of the way they do business.
It's a great point. AI has to be used. Well, it's going to be used in the attack. So we're going to have it probably in the defense as well. Any other thoughts on that particular topic before we move on from it?
I'm not sure quantum computing is going to be a big issue like real quick, but eventually it will. It's going to be a huge issue because its passwords will no longer be needed because it's going to be crackable too quickly. But the cost of quantum computing is too large for it to, we're not all going to have a quantum computer on our desktop in the next 5 years, I would guess. But nation states will. Nation states certainly will, and they will utilize it once it becomes more widespread. But I've been seeing, that's been a prediction for how many years, at the beginning of each year, what's the big threat for cybersecurity? Quantum computing. I haven't seen it yet, but maybe this is the year that one actually kicks. But it's coming sooner than later, certainly. But I wouldn't get all torqued up about it quite yet.
Yeah.
And Darren, that's a great point, and I'm really glad you brought it up because quantum computing and the transition to post-quantum cryptography, the United States government, the government itself, is leading the way in the entire planet. Right? We've done an excellent job. I say that because I was my team largely working on that along with NIST, OMB, but to actually be ready for that transition point, no other nation is even close to where we are. Which is why we have begun working with a group of like-minded nations on how do we speed up this transition globally. And part of that's also working with the private sector to ensure that PQC products are available. And I think most companies start seeing dollar signs there, then they'll start adopting it quicker. But yeah, PQC is definitely an area that I would put that more 5-10 years out. There's a number that we would say, but I don't think I can repeat it. When we think that a quantum relevant computer will be available. And by even that point, we're talking about a computer that can decrypt something in 24 hours. So that's not entirely useful. But it will become more useful. It will become faster. It will become more of a threat, which is why we begin working on these things now.
I have a question to follow on that, and maybe this is for you, Phil, or also Dan or anyone. There are no borders in cybersecurity. We're talking a bit about how our government and our private sector is well ahead, and we're cooperating with other governments. How can nations learn from each other? How can we build upon this? Are there things happening?
I gotta tell you, this is the most important discussion that we can be having in international relations. We all use the same systems. We all have the same vulnerabilities. We all have to take the same actions to fix them. how can we work together? It doesn't make any sense for every single one of us to go develop a secure patch on our own. We need to begin doing this together. And the area that I think that there can be a lot of global cooperation on is on open source. One country fixing a vulnerability within open source code makes that more secure for the entire commons. That is a good thing. And so I think there's a lot of work that we can each individually do to improve our systems within that open source framework that then becomes beneficial for everyone. So that's one thing that we can do. The other that we were really looking at, but I gotta tell you, we're at least 5-7 years out from, is harmonizing some regulations. There's a lot of good work that we could be doing here, particularly with the European Union. They're more on the forefront, and they generally take an approach that's more audit rather than security focused. But we can work together to try and set up a regime where if you are deemed to be secure within one of the Five Eyes countries, you're deemed to be secure in all.
Yep.
Right. Maybe not in your top secret networks, but on your unclassified networks.
Right.
So yeah, there's some really good work that we should be doing and could be doing, but we're really at the infancy of doing it.
I just add real quickly to that. I mean, I absolutely have to have visibility of what's going on around the world. We are all, interconnected, and that works. I mean, there's a lot of work that's been done in this around information sharing analysis centers, ISACs. But even that, there's different levels of how much cooperation and working together there is. There's a lot of duplicate work. And just jumping on what Phil said there at the end, the harmonization or even, trying to consolidate regulations, even in the U.S. You talk about internationally in the Five Eyes, I agree with you, Phil. But even the U.S., you think about the 35 or 40 different regs. You talk about all the different things people have to do. And complexity usually is the enemy of good cybersecurity. So we have so many complex people that are just focusing on that and making it simple, making it practical, as Darren was talking about, taking practical steps. I think that work of harmonization, that work of consolidation of regulations to get down and maybe have 80% of it's the same across, and maybe
right.
20, health might be different than criminal justice information, than different than others, but certainly in the unclassified world, not in the three-letter agency world, there needs to be harmonization. There needs to be consolidation, really, of regulations over the long term. But visual is, the working together is the key, making sure you're partnering and you have a good understanding of what's out there and knowing what's in your environment is really, really important.
Really excellent points. Dr. J, this kind of comes back to a thing that I know is near and dear to you, and that is education, this young generation. How do we bring them along for this ride? Are digital natives more receptive? Are they more ignorant? Like, what do you think?
No, no, that's a great question. Yeah. And yeah, for me, I that's something that's very important. I feel when it comes to education and preparing the next generation, especially if we're talking about for cybersecurity. One thing I'll quickly share, I think, is what helped me along my journey, was be able to see others doing the jobs, doing the work, and particularly those who look more like me doing it. I had to give a lot of credit to my uncle. So growing up in New York, my uncle at the time in Jersey, he was the IT specialist, and he had, did a whole bunch of IT components, this and that. And I was able to ask a bunch of questions and learn from him. And that's what kind of jumped, really sparked my interest when it came to first IT, even before cyber was a thing, but more into IT, and then evolved into cyber as my career led me down. But no, just I think the number one thing is, I say most important thing I say is mentorship, because we have younger generation who's very hungry, curious, wants to know more about it, how they can get started. We have to make sure we don't forget like where we came from, and that we started from the beginning at some point in our careers as well. And we have to make sure we do have that time. We give them that time and really sit down with them and understand, because everyone's story, everyone's journey is going to be different. One, so for instance, our recommendation for one person is not going to necessarily work for another. So I think really have to spend that time with each person and really understand where they are, kind of meet them where they are, and then help them to develop a plan as to see how they could be successful. Couple of things, my siblings right now, they're studying cybersecurity. Actually, my younger sister, she'll be graduating this spring from Miller, Georgia State University for a bachelor's in cybersecurity. My youngest son, he's in high school, 16 right now, and 15. He'll be 16 later this year, but he's looking to pursue cybersecurity as they're infusing more cybersecurity courses into the curriculum for his high school. So he comes to ask me and say, "Hey, Dad, what are some of the things I should focus on?" And that's a perfect example of why I say we have to meet people where they are, have an understanding of maybe their current skill set. What are some of the things that they're most interested in, and that way it can help prime them for a more successful career within cybersecurity. Because if you're doing something that you really enjoy and you're already kind of enhancing maybe your already inherent skills that you already have, that's gonna leave a higher percentage, I say, for you to be successful, or really for you to really enjoy what you're doing. So, and that way, and also too, you're gonna be an asset to whatever company or organization, or even if you're running your own organization at some point, you just really setting yourself up for success. So again, I just say that we have to make sure that we're just giving that proper time and understanding where they are and how we can help them, just being more intentional about that.
These are great points to wrap on. Mentorship, education, sharing cross borders. I mean, cyber criminals work across borders. We should be working from a defensive posture across borders and in cooperation with other friendly governments around the world. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. This has been a great discussion, panelists. Thank you for your time, your insights, and to our audience, thank you so much for spending a bit of your day with us. And you've got a lot to do. You've got hard choices to make, and we're extremely grateful that you were with us for this ride. As a reminder, this show is recorded and will be available on LinkedIn and YouTube. You can hit that subscribe button to stay in the loop on upcoming shows. We'll have others very soon. And also, just remember, liking and sharing is very much appreciated. If you have more questions, we're all on LinkedIn, everyone here. We're happy to chat with you. Don't hesitate to reach out, and let's keep the conversation going. So have a great morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world, and we'll see you all next on the next Ready, Set, Cyber.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.